So, my mic good? Good. Good morning, everybody. As I was introduced, I am a senior reporter with ProPublica. My byline is T. Christian Miller. I go by T. It's a family nickname short for Thomas, so please call me T. I was originally going to talk about this as being called creative data, and so I went down and wrote that up. That was my title of my talk. But then, as I was thinking about it, creative data sounds a little bit too much like you made it up. We're in the fake news era, so I redubbed it Vernacular Data, which I hope sounds a little bit academic-y too. So let me tell what I'm going to talk about today, and it kind of ties into what the previous speaker talked about, because Jupyter is one of the tools that is used in a field which is called data journalism. And data journalism is best explained by saying we're trying to marry the techniques of social science with the communication abilities of journalism. So we want to position ourselves in between the pure anecdotal stories that you often see in a journalistic context and the purely statistical analysis you'll see in a social science context. And the whole idea is we want to better communicate and pass on lessons that are being derived in the social sciences, the political sciences, economics, for readers. And I think our readers are growing increasingly sophisticated in their ability to understand and interpret data. And so data journalism is a very still new and developing field, but it attempts to better communicate information that otherwise might just remain stuck in a dusty academic journal somewhere. Not that any of you would know anything about that. So I'm going to go through 3 examples of where vernacular data has been used recently. I will begin to discuss some of the frameworks by which we can begin talking about this way of data collection and information. And it all begins with this basic premise. So some of you may be involved in the open data movement, which is opening up government information sets for wider public use. Investigative journalists in particular have a somewhat skeptical view of that practice because we are not in the habit of seeing the government release data which reveals problems by themselves, by their own government. And so an investigative journalist who's always looking for accountability, who did what, when, and to whom, I'm not expecting a big release of data from the FBI to show me how the FBI has screwed up a case. I'm expecting them to show me information which is very useful in general, talking about crime trends or hospital data which can show medical trends. But what we're looking for as investigative journalists is we look for planes that go down, not to stay up, and we want to find out why that plane crashed. And so for us, it's often a problem that we cannot access data which reveals anything about the story that we're tackling. So this is what a journalist, investigative journalist mindset, this is how I'm going to kind of take you through a couple of stories of how we think about things. Here's a report from the World Health Organization about US lagging far behind in maternal mortality. There are a number of studies which have recently shown that maternal mortality and morbidity have been on the increase in the United States in the past several years. What's happening? Why? What possibly explains that? There are a number of academic studies which have looked at that in sort of explaining why that occurs, looking at racial differences in care, looking at coverage by healthcare organizations. But this is kind of a chart which gets us someplace. But I want to tell the story of the mothers and the families who have had to undergo the mother dying on the same day that the child was born, or a mother a year later having some strange medical condition, and how can we address better to monitor those conditions. So this is the part of the story which is more focused on the anecdote side. So this particular example is more focused on how do we get anecdotes from data. It led to the series called Lost Mothers, which is running right now on ProPublica and has attracted quite a bit of attention. And it's because I think it does bring stories forth. So as a journalist, I'm now presented with this problem. I have a chart. I know maternal mortality is bad. I want to tell the story through some anecdotes, through some people. How do I find that? It's actually not easy. Hospitals can't release information about maternal mortality or morbidity. What do you do to find a person or a set of persons? And what we wanted to do was kind of try to move as much as we could toward data through our anecdotes. So our first story was this one. The last person you'd expect to die in childbirth. It's about Lauren Bloomstein, who was a neonatal nurse, had a very normal pregnancy, gave birth, and died of preeclampsia within 24 hours. If you are not moved or curious or impacted by the story of a neonate nurse who dies in her hospital, surrounded by her colleagues of pretty common maternal mortality cause, I can't reach you, right? I just can't get you. So this is the first stories, but we wanted to combine stories plus data. So how do we get more of these stories? The two reporters who are on this story are Nina Martin and Renee Montaigne. So for those of you who don't know about ProPublica, we're an investigative nonprofit organization. We do a lot with data. We do a lot of sort of regular shoe leather reporting, and we partner with bigger media organizations like NPR or the New York Times, the Washington Post, to do longer-term investigative stories. So in this case, we partnered up with NPR, which has astonishing reach. Nina discovered that by going to GoFundMe, now this is basic shoe leather reporting, GoFundMe, families who have lost their mothers or who have had an injury often go to GoFundMe and they post their stories. So Nina began by going to GoFundMe sites and connecting. It's kind of a nicer than sort of like knocking on somebody's door because you have a contact and would this person like to talk with us? So that's kind of where she's kicked off the stories. Then we have a very large Facebook presence. We put out calls for commentary from Facebook people. We created a community around mothers who have either experienced illness during their pregnancies or in worst case scenario have died. And we had them fill out Google forms to populate data sets. And we had, this was the message. Do you know someone who died or nearly died in childbirth? Help us investigate. So we, the news organization, are not seeking, we're not like going out and finding sources. We're having sources come to us who want to talk to us, as well as going out and reach them to GoFundMe. So then we get a series of stories that we begin to do off of the data as it comes in. One is about rural care in America. Another was in the UK, why the UK often has better rates of maternal mortality. And this is all based on Facebook. We should all know this by now, is global. So as we put our calls on Facebook, we're getting in submissions from all over the world. We ended up getting with 3,100 responses, and some researchers have told us that's one of the largest single collections of maternal mortality and morbidity information. So now there are researchers that we were speaking with at Stanford who may want to gain access to the information that was entered. We've also really engaged with these readers. We've formed this community, and then they reach out to their community. One of the kind of the basic stories is just advice, a simple advice column from women who have gone through this, and you might not hear this from your doctor, you might not hear this from your friend, but we're going to collect this wisdom of the crowd. So a lot of women have come to this site, have looked at it, and at least two of them have credited the story with saving their lives because they were able to recognize their preeclampsia responses. So that's taking a very kind of a story which we all maybe know or have paid attention to about rising maternal deaths, and making it more impactful by showing the faces of those people. All right, here's a second, more high-tech version where we're trying to track another database. Facebook political ads. We all heard the stories about Russian spying ads, but to me, the most surprising part of that whole story was that unlike television or radio stations or newspapers, which have to keep very close track of political ads, where the money comes from, how many minutes they broadcast it, how much it cost, what was the buy worth. Facebook has to do none of that. There is no transparency at all in political ads in Facebook, not who posted them, why they posted, how many they purchased, where they went. Facebook is not giving that information up for whatever reason. So what do we do about that? How can we overcome that? ProPublica has a set of about 10 coders and app developers who work full-time on data journalism questions. One of our coders created a plug-in to your Chrome extension. As you're browsing through Facebook, you click on this extension and it records and sends that ad, that name of that political ad, to a centralized database we're creating. And I encourage all of you to download this Facebook political ad collector, because it's the only way we're going to be able to figure out, we can sort of reverse engineer what political ads are, to whom they're being shown on the basis of your own sort of personal data. We might be able to get clues to who's financing these ads, who's paying them, and there's no other way, there's no data set that exists out there that can do anything like this. So it's basically an elaborate form of web scraping, where the scrapers are the crowd who are clicking and pointing and loading up this data. Now, we're still doing this for our stories in preparation for the midterm elections, but worldwide, the Germans had an election where they used this extensively. So the first story out of the box was actually a story written by some German news organizations who had used and downloaded that clicker for the recent elections in Germany. ProPublica's role in that was simply to kind of provide technical support for the use of the extension, the Chrome extension tool. We obviously didn't write stories about German politics, but it's one of the things that ProPublica does is we try and make our tools available and transparent so that other news organizations can use them. And that's part of our nonprofit mission. A normal media organization would not necessarily do that. But it's an exciting idea for journalists to say that we're going to be more collaborative and we're going to reach out to our readers to get this information that you can't get anywhere else. Right now, I know this is Jeff Larson is the name of the coder who's doing this, and he was on the phone all last week with Australia to do their election. So we're having a proof of concepts being tested in every other country before we get to the US. Documenting hate. So this is another thing where with the election of Trump last year, there was concerns about whether or not there was going to be an increase in hate crimes. To any of you who sort of pay attention to that field, the publicly available data on hate crimes is miserable. It's collected piecemeal by different individual police agencies. There's 18,000 police agencies in the country. None of them are bound by any particular set of data collection guidelines or enforcement. The FBI data gathers it all up at the end of the year, and they produce this half-assed, incomplete report about hate crimes. So we decided, much like the Washington Post did in their data set about collecting police shootings, which the same story, the FBI does collect information about when police shoot suspects, but it's incomplete and pretty half-assed, and doesn't include the dirty shootings for sure. We decided to begin documenting hate to kind of establish a baseline and find out what was going on. In this case, we didn't feel like turning to the crowd in terms of like just the readership would be particularly helpful, since we had some reason to suspect there would be any number of trolls and false entries and just people who were going to bring down our system. So in this case, we went to what we called our reporting network. We now have 80 media partners, and these 80 media partners, which they're local, national, there's ethnic-based media, there's public radio, there's television. What they're basically doing is as they look out, so part of their joining the network is they're looking for stories involving hate crime. So first of all, we're kind of raising the awareness to be able to sort of look for and find more hate crimes. And then they report those in. And there's a sort of a weekly session at ProPublica where we're trying to go beyond just the individual story here and the individual story there and make bigger connections. Another way we did that is we worked with Google News to create what we call the Documenting Hate Index. This is essentially a Google News search on steroids that they did, where they have some more filtering in the algorithm to pull out possible and suspected hate crimes. Those are then automatically dumped into a database, which we've made available. It's raw data, no representations made about the accuracy or quality of that data. It's very raw data. But you can, if you want to, as a researcher, as a newspaper, as an interested person, can download that data and begin doing your own work on it. So we shared this with any other users. Just recently, we did a story which was based on some of the trends we found about an emerging hate group in Southern California called RAM. I don't know what the RAM stands for. It stands for something amusing to them. But it's an emerging hate group which has been very active in Charlottesville and other places recently in terms of deliberately going to these things to cause violence and do violence. And so for that, we did a story on that, and we posted sort of video which the RAM group posted online, and we've been able to identify some of the members of this group and sort of call them out and say, this guy lives here, police officer. Here's a video of him beating somebody to death, or not to death, beating somebody badly here. So why don't you get on the stick? So that's the Documenting News Hate Index. And this is an example where we're both creating data from our users and from other news sources that we might not have access to. All right, so that's what I call vernacular data. So why do I call it vernacular data? Because I already explained creative data sounded too bad. But vernacular data is the idea that we are all data systems, and that we are all producing data and collecting data all the time in ways that 10 years ago would be very difficult. But now, if you have a Fitbit, if you have a mobile phone, are very easy to collect data which would be of interest. And all I need to do is to convince you to share some of that data with me. Or collect you to share your experiences with me, or to convince you to fill out a form. It's folk data. It's like sort of data which you can't easily get. There's no public source that's collecting it. Researchers collect great data, but they often sort of keep it. It's not transparent. It's not available to us. And the most important point of researcher data is usually what we kind of know. We know going in that a research study has found X or Y or Z. We're trying to bring it more to life with the vernacular data. The vernacular data is also important because it comes from a position of not of power, but of oppression, in terms of like, not oppression is too strong a word, but it's people who generally are not in the business of creating and making data, but we're reaching out to them to hear those voices and to make those voices into something that we can analyze outside of sort of the official world of information. A couple ideas of what I'm sort of toying around as definitions of vernacular data. It's created by users through sensors, mobile sensors that they have, or through personal data mining. Like an interest of mine is in email sets and doing corpuses of email and analyzing those from public figures. How do I mine that data better? Data used in creative ways. So we're unearthing previously unknown crimes or trends, like this RAM group. Nobody had studied this particular emergence of this particular hate group. We wouldn't have necessarily known about it unless we were to spend just hours looking at hate media. But through the Documenting News Index and through sources as well, we were told about this group and we investigated them. So it's kind of it's creating information for us to source off of. And then finally, I call it democratized data, which is the idea that this is information that we all have, and all we need is a mechanism to share it and spread it out. Some other examples, because I want to talk about both horrible failures and successes. So medicine cabinet. I did a story a couple years ago about acetaminophen, or Tylenol. That's the active ingredient in Tylenol. Acetaminophen happens to be an exceptionally dangerous drug in terms of the margin of safety between its maximum daily dose and the dose at which you can begin to damage the liver, where the acetaminophen acts. And so I did a big story about that. And one of the issues with acetaminophen is that it's often contained in multiple medicines that you can buy over the counter. So if you're not paying attention, you can be prescribed hydrocodone for a pain pill. You can take some Tylenol to kind of add up. And then you can take a cold medicine, which also has Tylenol. And you can really easily go over the recommended dose if you're not paying attention to all the different acetaminophen contained in these one products. So to kind of illustrate that, I was like, ooh, let's have people take pictures of their medicine cabinet, and then we'll point out, like, oh, here's the 8 things you have in your medicine cabinet right now which have acetaminophen. That was horrible. Guess what? Nobody wants to take pictures of the medicine cabinet. Not even cleaned up, right? That didn't work. But I thought it was it would be a cool idea to kind of show how much of this you may have not knowing it in your medicine cabinet. We ended up doing a graphic which is kind of interactive, which allowed you to kind of mix different medicines and show how quickly you would get to an overdose. Immigrant rest breaks. This is another idea which I hope to find one day, which is that, as you know, California and other agricultural states mandate a certain amount of breaks for people who are working in the fields, who are often immigrants. And there's nobody policing. Nobody actually is out there. No Department of Ag inspectors out there policing. So if you could convince, or in a way which would not endanger the workers, expose them to any kind of retribution through a Fitbit, through a mobile device, to sort of those devices can measure how often you're bending and stooping and moving or resting, and then you could see what farms or what areas are actually keeping track of and making sure that workers have access to bathrooms, have access to breaks during the day for the labor that they're doing. So I haven't done that yet, but that's one of my ideas. Lobbying power. This is a great thing that NPR now does. If you're aware of how things work on Capitol Hill, there's a final hearing before any bill. There's a big gallery of people who sit and listen to the senators pontificate before they pass this bill or this hearing, or make a recommendation to pass it. And those galleries are not filled with everyday Americans paying attention to their government. They're mostly filled with lobbyists and industry officials who are there to kind of be able to pull aside legislators and make their case for why this particular earmark should stay in or go out. So NPR has now they'll come behind the senator and take a picture of you guys, the crowd, and then puts that out and says, who are these people? Who are here today monitoring the functions of democracy? And everybody in town, everybody in DC who knows everybody else is like going in there, identifying people's faces and saying who they are. And sure enough, there's 90% lobbyists, right? Not really confusing, not really surprising. But you get to see, that sort of displayed. Sensors that pick up environmental data is another issue. I think it's going to be very exciting, interesting in the next few years. The California wildfires and the smoke levels and what those were those monitored appropriately or not, we don't know. But air pollution sensors now are getting down to a cost when it wouldn't be a difficult thing for a news organization or a group of news organizations to say, we're going to monitor Chevron's refinery and how it works in that neighborhood, and we're going to monitor it. And we're going to get sensors, and we're going to sort of consult with environmental experts, and we're going to put these sensors in so that we can have information that we don't have to go to Chevron, or we don't have to go through the California Air Quality Board, who then has to go to Chevron and get the data. We can get the data directly ourselves. Police profiling. This was done in a Detroit newspaper where there were complaints from a neighborhood that there was a couple of cops who were especially abusive. And so what they set up was, surreptitiously, cell phone cameras that would record every time a police cruiser came in to a neighborhood, and would record that license plate or record that squad car number. And through that, they were able to kind of build a picture of what the patrol patterns were of different officers were and when the complaints were spiking, and kind of put those two together, and then have some, what we would call it sort of a direction, a tip to go after and research, okay, who are these police? Oh, that guy who drives that cruiser has a file this thick in internal affairs, so maybe we should pay attention to him. Personal data mining. So this is some of the campaign messages. The crucial thing with Facebook, one of the crucial things is not just that they're showing these ads and not saying who's financing them, but to whom they are being shown, right? That's something that we can tell very precisely with Facebook, but nothing else. No radio or TV show. I can't tell you with that granular level of precision. So what we're hoping to be able to do is, are the white racist ads only being showed to other white racists, or are they being showing to people who may have an interest in nationalism, but yet haven't sort of like crossed the line into being full-on racist? So are they being used to recruit in that way? And that we hope that message will say that. Social analysis is the same way. Instagram, you can, there's ways to download information from Instagram that are astonishing in terms of the richness of the data. That I did a story a couple years ago about a former football star who'd been accused of raping 9 women. And there was we were able to kind of trace where he was saying he wasn't. We could trace where he was because he was so often depicted on Instagram by other people because he was famous. So we were taking Instagram pictures, so we just went to Instagram, downloaded every sort of time he'd been cited. We can then plot that on a map and say, yeah, you were right here, right here, right here, right here. Here's a picture of you on the bus with that sitting on that woman's leg who said she raped you. Or he raped her, sorry. But social data is an immensely rich source of data, but it's also, not freely given. The Twitter, Facebook of the world keep their data private. Okay, so how do we get to making data more available? So in data journalism, which is still a new field, it's increasingly easy. We have increasingly tools like Jupyter, like R, to download and access information on a scale which we couldn't do before. So last year, or 2 years ago now, ProPublica struck a deal with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, where we downloaded the name of every doctor and the name of every prescription they had ever issued, and we could compare the doctors, the prescriptions, and the money they were getting from pharmaceutical representative companies to kind of show, there was a correspondence between prescribing patterns and the amount of money or gifts or trips that have been given to a particular physician. That was 109 million records, and it was all done with mostly open source tools. So how do we get there? I'm saying it's easier now to analyze existing data that exists now in a way that's going to be very rich and very rewarding. Going forward, though, how do we create data now? How do we make data more available to us to get beyond these simple, easy prototypes, simple, easy anecdotal stories? So rapid experiments and bias for prototypes. This comes straight from the language of Silicon Valley. I happen to believe it in this case, that we have to do lots of small experiments to be able to figure out the best ways to capture data that we all possess and own. There's all kinds of people who will be able to use vernacular data. Journalists are an extreme case. I mean, we're only looking for accountability data, essentially, the stuff that shows who the bad guys are. Data producers, truth seekers, anybody else who wants to sort of get to the bottom of an issue that they currently can't, or it would take years to get information. The Freedom of Information Act, which is the primary tool to get data from the federal government, and there's state versions as well, can be incredibly painful, slow, and not very rewarding. So perhaps you can hop to the front of the line with documenting hate by creating your own hate database, or you can jump to the front of the line on police shootings by creating your own police shooting database. And then entrepreneurship. So Document Cloud was developed, I want to say 6, 7 years ago now. It's used mostly by journalists. We'd like to sort of expand its base, but it ingests PDFs, other documents, converts them into text, and then we have various algorithms there to create like timelines, to do entity analysis, entity identification, so you can surface who is most often used or mentioned in these set of texts, that kind of thing. Email analysis is another, I think, field which is going to be bigger and bigger. We've seen big, giant email dumps from Hillary Clinton and the State Department emails to Sarah Palin and her emails. That is an incredibly rich source of data when it's done in a native format, like in the Outlook or Gmail format. For investigative reporters or for any reporters, it sort of provides a roadmap to who they were meeting with, when, where, why, what they were discussing. And a good email analysis tool, if anyone knows out there, I'm open for it, is still lacking for sort of individual email sets of analysis. So this is how we get there. And then just to close up, to reemphasize the idea of vernacular data and what it does. It frees data that we all have captured, stored away in email boxes, phones, wherever. It frees users to be able to access and understand their own lives and their own data in a way that's directly meaningful and personal to them. And then it frees journalism because we're no longer bound by whatever we get from some kind of official agency or source. We can have some confidence that we're getting data that reflects directly on the problem, that's not a proxy, that actually speaks directly to the issue that we want to find. So that's vernacular data. Thank you.
T, thanks very much. Incredibly important and timely work. We've got 7 or 8 minutes for some questions. Let's take one at the right on the edge here, sir.
First off, thank you so much for coming. Really awesome to hear all the work that you guys are doing. Just a question on open source data. We all know it's a double-edged sword of who's using it, who's contributing to it, and who's accessing it. Have you guys run into issues with people abusing the data you make available and or submitting things in a way? Do you have a mitigation plan? Have you used it, and what is it when it inevitably will happen?
So it has happened because another story we did was on doctors who prescribe opioids. And we sort of fingered the doctors who most prescribed opioids and made that database available to search. Do you know who searched our opioid database? Exactly, it was the abusers. It was people who wanted to find doctors who would prescribe opioids without anything. So that was who began like flooding our hit site. And I'm not sure exactly how we determined this, but we determined like it was mostly people who wanted to find doctors who would prescribe opioids easily, not from people who wanted to avoid those doctors. So we wrote a whole story about that we had made this, where to go get your illegal drugs doctor available and free. We did not take the database down, but we wrote about that, and so now when you go to the database, there's a story about that, but we didn't take it down. And some of that discussion was the same discussions you always hear around open source data. There are these people who are going to abuse it. If we take it down, though, are we removing a resource for people who, regulators, for instance, who'd want to look for some of these doctors in their particular states, for instance, who otherwise wouldn't know a regulator in Florida because states are, a lot of the medical stuff is regulated by state medical boards, may not know that this doctor also practices across the border in Alabama, and if you put them together, his practice does stand out. So we kept that up, but that is a discussion that we would have, for instance, in I can see them just documenting hate database. We may be giving the right-wing racist groups of the world a map to like, oh, we haven't been to this place yet. Maybe we need to go over here. And I don't know what to say about that other than that's something that journalists face in general all the time when they're doing stories is, once the story leaves your hands, what can be done with it? And what is our responsibility to that? And in general, the call is that we release data. We're not in the business of keeping information or data, period. But there are occasions when we make the decision, no, this is can be abused too easily, or it may reveal something that's going to be used in a bad way. And those common examples, like in national security stories, a lot of times, there'll be a decision made to sort of kind of hide where some of the information came from, to protect the sources, or there'll be a decision made to like not run a story in extreme circumstances if we get a call from the President of the United States and they say this is going to endanger national security. We weigh and debate that with the presumption that we're going to publish, but if you can make an argument that this will actually put CIA agents in danger, then we'll try and adjust our story in ways that will address that concern.
Thanks. There was another question in the gentleman in the check shirt behind you there. Yeah.
Hi. I had a quick question about, when you're doing your data collection, your data exploratory, like a narrative tends to develop. Like what type of methods do you go through to kind of maintain objectivity and not try and find data that confirms or goes against your story, but like what type of like peer reviews or what type of techniques do you use to kind of maintain objectivity as you're sorting through all of this data that you're collecting?
A couple. There's a bunch of sort of built-ins. I would first say that more often what happens is you have a data set, and then that data shows that women of color suffer more maternal mortality events, right? And so we'll go and try and illustrate that particular trend rather than finding, here's a person who has preeclampsia, now I got to go find some data that will back up that trend. So it's still more that the data powers the finding of the narrative rather than the narrative finding the power of finding the statistics, although it does work both ways. So how do we keep it objective? It's kind of built in. First of all, we don't always. Easy answer, we don't always. We do try to mitigate that by the profession as a whole. We're skeptics. We go through multiple layers of editing. But the big acid test really is we publish and our competitors look and will rain shit on your story if you're wrong. In some ways, this may not go over well in this crowd, but I think that our system is more effective than peer review because we publish and then it gets crapped on publicly and you're humiliated and you got to run a correction and you know what? You don't do that anymore, right? And it's instantaneous. The feedback is instantaneous and it's from everyone all the time. And then you run a big retraction, you take your story back if it's wrong, and it's not like retraction watch, which is sort of sits there, maybe part of the story, part of the journal may not. Part of it is deliberate, like we are always looking for and trying to find problems with objectivity. Some newspapers have murder boards, they're called, or red teams, which they go and try to report against the story. And since that's actually paid labor, not free, a lot of times people spend a lot of time trying to take down a story internally in a newsroom. Then when it's published, our business is super competitive, so people will pick apart that story. On that story we did about where we looked at medical records of doctors, another story we looked at medical records of doctors and a couple specialties like knee surgery who had a higher than average rate of complications. The methodology for that story, which we published, was it was like a white paper, a 40 or 50 page methodology paper, and that was subject of severe academic debate by statisticians and medical folks who were looking at that data. So it is something that we build in the process, but it's also something that sort of comes naturally by the way structurally how the business is set up.
Let's take maybe 2 questions. Was there? Yeah.
Really just following on from that, on that story about maternal deaths, you point out that the best way to get people to engage with the data is to find an individual story. Mm-hmm. Right. But then how do you balance that issue that then people are distorted in their view of the data by an individual story? I'm thinking particularly of like the Kate Steinle issue here where, it's used by people, her death is used as evidence that, all illegal immigrants must be murderers.
Right, so in that story, even in that first story we did with Laura Bloomstein, the victim of that story, and this is how all the stories are, there's a part where the story kind of goes and the narrative technique is you sort of have a cliffhanger, and then you discuss the statistics behind it. I would bet that very few, if any, of the stories about that particular incident have a lot of data built into them. So the way I would approach, if I was doing a story where I found out that immigrants were responsible for X percentage of shootings, you would still use that example, but then you would sort of have to base it out on whatever the information said. And you would say, we downloaded ICE data, immigration data, and crossed it with police shootings or murders in California, and we found that immigrants make up 10% of the population and 2% of the shootings, or something like that. And that's how you sort of could still use that example, because you're always building in. It's basically you're sugarcoating the data by having a narrative story which people can move through and they get. And the idea, hopefully, is they're engaged enough to find out what more is to say about this? What more is there about this in a single case? And we sort of lay that out in the statistics part. And then you jump back into the narrative. So the narrative is like, it's a storytelling technique where you're weaving back and forth between what we hope is a gripping and interesting narrative, and then you begin to care more about the statistics because you see how they fit in this in a small space and how they can refer to much larger trends and issues.
T, thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to get any more questions. Are you going to stick around for the break?
No.
Okay, all right. All right, listen, if anyone wants to run out when T's going there, I apologize. Okay, please join me in thanking T for...
Thank you.